Okay, so you want to buy a house in Detroit for $1. $1. Not a typo, not a gimmick, an actual number that has shown up on actual auction listings from the city of Detroit itself. It sounds like the greatest real estate deal in American history. It is not. Detroit has roughly 30,000 vacant structures within its city limits, sitting across nearly 139 square miles, an area big enough to physically fit Boston, Manhattan, and San Francisco inside it with room to spare. Somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 of those properties move through the city's auction and land bank system every single year. The starting bid on the worst of them really is $1. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the dollar house is real, and also almost never the actual price. How the true cost of ownership gets hidden in a number nobody puts on the listing. Why the city itself built a legal trap into the deal on purpose. And why the same program that gives away houses for $1 is also the reason entire blocks of Detroit still sit empty today. Let's start with what $1 actually buys you. The Detroit Land Bank Authority is the largest owner of vacant property in any city in America, holding title to tens of thousands of parcels that came back to the city through tax foreclosure, abandonment, or straight demolition of what used to stand there. Some of that inventory is empty lots, some of it is structures, and a portion of those structures, the ones judged too far gone to sell at a normal price, get listed starting at $1,000, sometimes discounted further in specific auction categories, down toward that famous dollar figure you see in the headlines. The city is not being generous. It is trying to get a liability off its books. A vacant, untaxed, unmaintained structure costs the city money every year it sits there, in code enforcement, in fire risk, in blight that drags down the value of every occupied home on the same block. Selling it for $1 and getting a tax-paying owner into it is, from the city's perspective, a rounding error compared to the alternative, which is paying to demolish it themselves. Demolition of a single residential structure in Detroit runs the city between $15,000 and $25,000, depending on size and hazardous material abatement. $1 house is not a subsidy to you. It's the cheapest liability write-off the city has. So you win the auction. You pay your $1 or your $1,000, plus a buyer's premium and back property taxes that may already be owed on the parcel, which by themselves can run anywhere from a few hundred to several $1,000s, depending on how long the property sat delinquent. You now own a house. Here is the part the headline never mentions. That house, in the overwhelming majority of cases, has had no functioning utilities for years. No heat, which in a city that regularly drops below freezing for 4 months a year means burst pipes, cracked foundations from freeze-thaw cycles, and mold from years of uncontrolled moisture. No occupancy means no one catching the roof leak in year 1 before it becomes a collapsed ceiling by year 3. Copper pipe and wiring, the two most valuable scrap materials in any abandoned structure, have in a large share of these properties already been stripped out entirely, sometimes by the same scrappers who strip Detroit's vacant housing stock as an actual informal trade. You are not buying a house, you are buying a shell that used to be a house, and the gap between those two things is where the real number lives. Rehab estimates on a genuine Detroit land bank property routinely run between $75,000 and $125,000 for a full gut renovation, new electrical, new plumbing, new roof, structural repair, code compliance from the studs out. On the more severely deteriorated end of the inventory, contractors have quoted figures north of $150,000. Compare that to the dollar you paid for the deed, and the real cost of ownership snaps into focus immediately. You didn't buy a $1 house. You bought a $100,000 renovation project with a $1 down payment on the land under it. And here's the detail that makes this different from every other fixer-upper story in America. The Detroit Land Bank Authority does not let you sit on it. Every land bank sale in the program comes attached to a legal requirement, most commonly, a 190-day renovation deadline written directly into the deed. You have roughly 6 months from closing to bring the structure up to code, pull the required permits, and pass a final inspection, or the city retains the right to take the property back through the deed restriction, sometimes without refunding what you've already spent. This is not a soft suggestion. It is enforced. The city has taken back properties from buyers who missed the window, and the entire clause exists for one reason: to stop exactly the behavior the free dollar house would otherwise encourage: buying it, doing nothing, and letting the block rot for another decade under a new owner's name instead of the old one. The dollar price and the 190-day clock are the same policy, wearing two different faces. One gets you in, the other makes sure you actually finish the job. Now let's talk about who actually clears this successfully. The buyers who make the Detroit dollar house model work are almost never first-time homeowners looking for a bargain. They're contractors, or investors, who already have a contractor relationship, who can move fast on permits, source materials at trade pricing instead of retail, and self-perform enough of the labor to keep that $100,000 rehab number closer to $60,000 or $70,000. For that buyer, the math genuinely works. A rehabbed home in a stabilizing Detroit neighborhood, in areas like Bagley, Boston Edison, or parts of the East Side that have seen real reinvestment, can appraise for $150,000 to $250,000 once finished, depending on block and square footage. Buy the shell for $1, put in $70,000 in owner-managed rehab, and you've built $80,000 to $180,000 in equity in under a year. That is a legitimate, repeatable business model, and it's exactly why a meaningful share of Detroit land bank buyers are LLCs and repeat investors rather than individual families. For the individual buyer without a contractor background, without cash reserves for a rehab loan, and without the ability to personally swing a hammer 8 hours a day for 5 months straight, the 190-day clock turns the dollar deal from an opportunity into a trap. Rehab financing on a property this deteriorated is genuinely hard to get. Most conventional mortgage lenders won't touch a home that fails a basic habitability inspection, which nearly every land bank property does on day one. That pushes buyers toward renovation-specific loan products, or straight cash, which prices out exactly the population the Dollar House program was originally marketed to help. The Detroit Land Bank Authority's own public messaging leans hard into first-time buyer accessibility. The lived reality of the 190-day deadline leans hard toward whoever already has a construction crew on retainer. Here's the risk almost nobody researches before bidding. Title: a Detroit Land Bank property comes through tax foreclosure, and tax foreclosure titles carry a documented history of legal challenges. Some properties auctioned by the city have later been contested by former owners, heirs, or lien holders who argue the foreclosure process itself was flawed, and Michigan courts have in fact ruled against the county in specific foreclosure cases over the past decade, forcing clawbacks and settlements. Title insurance on these properties exists, but it is not automatic, and skipping it to save a few $100s on a dollar house is the single most common mistake first-time buyers make in this market. You can spend $80,000 rehabbing a home you do not fully, permanently own, and find that out in a courtroom 2 years later instead of at closing. Now zoom out, because the dollar house isn't really a story about individual bargains. It's a symptom of something much bigger. Detroit's population peaked at 1.8 million people in 1950. It sits today at roughly 630,000, a decline of nearly 2/3 over 7 decades, driven by the collapse of the domestic auto manufacturing base that built the city in the first place, by white flight through the 1960s and 70s, and by a wave of foreclosures during the 2008 financial crisis that the city never fully recovered from. A city built with the housing stock and infrastructure to support 1.8 million people, now trying to function with a third of that population, produces exactly what you'd expect: tens of thousands of structures with no one left to live in them. The Dollar House program is not really a housing policy. It's a population math problem wearing a real estate listing. And the program has a documented failure rate to go with it. Independent tracking of Detroit's auction inventory has found that a meaningful share of properties sold through the city's programs over the past decade, in some analyses more than a quarter, were resold, abandoned again, or demolished within a few years of the original sale, the renovation deadline notwithstanding. Enforcement of the 190-day clause has itself been inconsistent, with the city sometimes granting extensions and sometimes not, depending on staffing and political pressure in a given year. The tool built to force renovation doesn't reliably force renovation. It just filters out the buyers too slow or too undercapitalized to beat the clock, while a portion of the properties cycle right back into vacancy regardless. Here's the last piece, and it's the one that determines whether any of this actually pays off. Location inside Detroit matters more than almost anywhere else in the country, because the recovery has been wildly uneven. Downtown and Midtown have seen genuine billion-dollar scale private investment over the past 15 years, led by figures like Dan Gilbert's real estate holdings, and home values in those cores have risen accordingly. Large sections of the East Side and far West Side have seen almost none of that, and a rehabbed home there can struggle to appraise anywhere near what the renovation actually cost, because the comparable sales on the block are still mostly land bank shells and vacant lots. The exact same $100,000 rehab, on the exact same square footage, can produce $200,000 in equity 3 miles from downtown, or barely break even 8 miles further out. The dollar is identical everywhere. The math around it is not. Step back for a second. A Detroit dollar house is a real thing, sold by a real government agency for a real dollar. It is also, in the overwhelming majority of cases, a $100,000 construction project wrapped around a 6-month legal deadline, sitting on a title with documented legal risk, in a location where the surrounding market may or may not support what you're about to spend. The city needs the liability gone. The auction is designed to move it off the books as fast and as cheaply as possible. Whether that transaction is a life-changing bargain or an expensive mistake depends entirely on whether the buyer standing at the counter has a contractor's toolbox or just a dollar. 2 scenarios, real numbers. Scenario 1. The investor contractor wins a land bank auction at $1,000 including premium, pays roughly $2,500 in back taxes and fees, self-performs half the labor, and brings total rehab cost to $65,000 in a recovering East Side pocket near new private investment. Total all-in cost, roughly $68,500. Appraised value on completion, $190,000. Net equity built in under 7 months, north of $120,000. This is the version of the story that gets the headlines. Scenario 2. The first-time individual buyer wins the same style of auction for $1,000 but has no construction background and needs a licensed general contractor for the entire job. Full gut rehab quoted at $115,000, financed through a high-rate renovation loan because conventional lenders won't touch it. The 190-day clock forces rushed permitting and change orders that push the final rehab bill to $140,000. Total all-in cost, north of $145,000, in a neighborhood where comparable finished homes are still selling in the $130,000 to $150,000 range because the surrounding blocks haven't turned yet. This buyer breaks even at best and carries 6 figures of renovation debt against a home that may not have appreciated enough to justify it. In 2013, Detroit filed the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, $18 billion in debt, the visible endpoint of the population collapse that had been building for 60 years. The Dollar House program grew directly out of that wreckage, a city with more empty structures than it could ever demolish, trying to turn a liability into a resident 1 parcel at a time. More than a decade later, the program is still running, still making headlines, still selling houses for $1. Some of those houses are now finished, occupied, and worth 6 figures more than what their owner paid. Others are still sitting exactly where they were the day the auction closed, one missed deadline away from going right back to the city that sold them. The dollar gets you in the door. What happens after that is the actual business.